Again, this is the USS Montana requesting that you immediately divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Over.
Please divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid collision.
This is Captain Hancock. You will divert your course. Over.
Negative, Captain. I'm not moving anything. Change your course. Over.
So, this is the USS Montana, the second largest vessel in the North Atlantic Fleet. You will change course 15 degrees north, or I will be forced to take measures to ensure the safety of this ship. Over.
This is the lighthouse, mate. It's your call. Hello, Captain? I think he's gone.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from in the world, and thank you for choosing to spend the next hour and a half with us. On the note of the webinar, the video that you have just seen, having the right information at your fingertips is the most important thing in today's changing economy. And so we look forward to hearing from Clem Sunter tonight as he takes us through a couple of scenarios. Joining me tonight, as I've said, is Clem Sunter. We are very excited to have him, and Scott Picken, the head of the Global Wealth Group. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me tonight.
Awesome. No, thanks, Lee, for organizing. Really appreciate it.
As always, we like to know where you are joining us from, and we have had an overwhelming response to our webinar with Clem. So please do pop in the chat box where you are joining us from. We'd love to hear. As we have got so many people online for this webinar, we really request that if you are going to ask questions throughout it, to please pop it in the Q&A box and not put it in the chat. It's just going to make it a little bit easier for myself and the panelists to actually see your question and make sure that we get as many of them answered as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Scott.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Lee. And Clem, it's always an honor and a privilege to be on a webinar with you. Clearly, your message at the moment is really important because over 2,200 people from all over the world have signed up to this webinar. So I look forward to an exciting evening and sharing what is happening. And just to give a little bit of context in case anyone is not sure, Clem effectively is an internationally acclaimed authority on management strategy, scenario planning, and corporate social responsibility. He's the former CEO and chairman of the gold and uranium division of South African mining giant Anglo American. He's widely renowned as a leading scenario planner. He's the author of 17 different books on leadership, crisis management, planning, and strategy. He's lectured at Harvard Business School in Boston, as well as the Central Party School in Beijing. And recently, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Cape Town for his work in the heart of scenario planning. And one of the things I loved was listening to an interview you did recently with Alec Hogg, and I think it probably summed it up best, Clem, which said that you are actually a national treasure, which I think was brilliant. I absolutely loved it. This is the book tonight that we're going to be discussing, Thinking the Future, which has just come out. And I'm actually really, really excited. I have my copy here, and I basically devoured this book on the airplane last night. I've flown from South Africa to Zurich, so I've read it cover to cover. And I love what you've got right in the beginning of the book. It says, this book is dedicated to the giants who will come, upon whose shoulders others will stand to unwrap the mysteries of the future. And so what our invitation tonight is that this book is amazing. I highly, highly recommend it. And what we're going to do is that Clem has agreed to give 5 copies, signed copies, to the most interactive participants. So that's people that are asking questions or participating and or using social media with the handles Clem Sunter, Thinking the Future, Wealth 5.0, and the Wealth Movement. So take a note of those handles for social media and let's get engaged. We've got an awesome opportunity. I will say one thing that I think is amazing is that having read the book, having been on and listened to a lot of the interviews, often it's a one-sided conversation. And what the beauty tonight is that it's a Q&A type environment where we get to actually really get to understand the deeper understanding of what is actually happening within this book. The next thing that I wanted to share, which I think is important, is that last year we ran a concept called Wealth 5.0. We had some of the leading learners around the world sharing what is happening in the investment, in the real estate, in the technology space. If you want to go to the links from 2020, you can see that the links are actually there. And something I'll talk about when Clem is finished is that we're really excited that tonight is effectively the start of our next series for 2021. And it couldn't have started with a better person to really think about where the world is going, what do we do, how do we think about it, and how do we take all these changes that have happened. So I'll share with you later about what the dates are and how they're going to be happening over the next 3 months or so. So I want to hand to you, Clem, and before I do, I just wanted to understand a little bit around the scenario planning. And I think it's really interesting because, you know, if you look at this slide here around Wealth 5.0, there's some quotes that you've got in the book here. And it says, to understand is to perceive patterns by Isaiah Berlin. And don't go through life as blinkered racehorse looking straight in front of you. Take your blinkers off to see the future around you, Pierre Wack. Now, we're going to talk more about these people, but I wanted to go into the philosophy of scenario planning. And before I do and hand over to you, Clem, and you explain to us, I know that many people on this webinar would have read the book that's, I think, nearly 20 years old now in terms of Mind of the Fox. But I just wanted to share what I was sharing with Clem before we joined. Reading the book last night, it was like getting a crash course in philosophy over the last couple of thousand years. You know, I learned from Plato and Aristotle and their blueprints of the world. I learned from Isaiah Berlin and Archaeologus on the hedgehog and the foxes. I learned from Socrates on first principles and questioning assumptions. I learned about Stoic principles, and I wanted to read this because I thought this was pretty relevant. My girlfriend's been trying to get to England and has had huge challenges getting via Botswana, Ethiopia, and America. And it says, the Stoic philosophers stressed that we should focus on a range of actions within our control in order to handle the challenges beyond our control. This is particularly important in tough situations. With this attitude, fear can be replaced by determination to do the best we can in the circumstances, with the possibility of emerging stronger as a result of the experience. And I just thought with COVID, that would be very relevant for her and with everyone else. I learned from Pierre Wack on scenario planning and multiple possible futures, Karl Popper on the spectrum of predictability, David Hume, basing knowledge on hard data obtained from experience, Charles Darwin on the most successful species adapt to a changing environment, Hannah Arendt, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, Philippa Foot, Martin Luther King, and David Devine Veronica on the personal and institutional morality are central to any options. And then finally, Steve Jobs and Nelson Mandela on converting future thinking into action. And so without further ado, Clem, you know, I can't summarize a book in a webinar, and neither can you. And I highly recommend that people go and read the book. However, let's take a step back in history, your history. How did you learn about scenario planning, and why is it so important for people to understand the principles and the concepts before we go into the scenarios?
Well, I wrote this book with Mitch Ilbery, who is Chantal Ilbery's son. She and I wrote The Mind of a Fox. And what we've tried to do is show the philosophical backing to the whole theory of looking at multiple futures as opposed to trying to bet on a single future. So that's where this book is different from the others. And I'm very glad to say that at the biggest bookshop in South Africa, Exclusive Books at Hyde Park, it is the #1 selling book at the moment. Essentially, scenario planning started in 1960 with a guy called Herman Kahn, who was an advisor to the US Defense Force. And he wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, where he played a scenario of a flat-out conflict between Russia and America. And because he lived in California, close to Hollywood, he decided to call the methodology he used in the book scenario planning, because movie producers write scenarios of the story of the movie so that they can sell it to, financiers. And he thought, yeah, I'm writing a story about the future, about a conflict between Russia and America. and I'm going to call it a scenario. And then he added the word planning because it's about the future. And that's how the term scenario planning was born. And he showed that utter destruction that would be caused if America and the Soviet Union went to war. And it was a very popular book. But what was really important was that 2 years later, in 1962, the Soviet Union and America came closest to a war because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Russia had planted quite a few missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev and Kennedy came head to head. And in the end, Russia did back down. But it got very close. And a lot of people say that one of the things that was considered by both sides was Herman Kahn's book. And it showed how scenarios work. You put a possibility in front of people, in this case, a possibility to avoid. And they did. So he became quite famous, Herman Kahn, and he set up his own institute. And my mentor, a Frenchman called Pierre Wack, after studying in India, in Indian ashrams, he decided to go and study with Herman. And he thought, I can use this technique in a business environment. So he went back to London at the beginning of the 70s and set up a scenario planning unit at Royal Dutch Shell. And he captured both oil price shocks in scenarios. He didn't forecast them. And this is the whole difference between scenario planning and forecasting. And you can be far more extreme with scenario planning because you're not saying, I predict this will happen. You're saying, here is a future possibility. And he wrote two sets of scenarios, one in the early 70s, that the price of oil could jump from $3 a barrel to something like 10. In fact, it went to $12 a barrel. And then in the second half of the 70s, he said it could jump from 12 maybe to $30 a barrel, when everybody thought it would probably stay around 12. And Shell, on the second occasion, bet on his scenario, and they made a lot of money. And Pierre became a legend in London. And it came to our attention, Anglo-American, as the largest mining company, that if Shell could use it to play different possibilities for the oil price, perhaps we could do the same for all the minerals that we produced, and for gold, and for diamonds, and other commodities. And so we asked Pierre to come to South Africa and give us a lecture, which he did. And he totally bewitched us. And I was the secretary of the Anglo executive at the time. So he said, the chairman, Gavin Relly, turned to me and said, in addition to your normal mining responsibilities, would you mind taking on the function of setting up a scenario planning team in Anglo? And it was the best thing that happened to me, because I spent over 10 years with Pierre, probably the finest futurist in the world at the time. And we not only in the mid-80s devised scenarios for the global economy, one of which, I have to say, was the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, which actually happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990. We felt that the Soviet Union would go bankrupt because of the arms race, but of course it was Mikhail Gorbachev that brought the end to the empire. But then secondly, we decided to write scenarios for South Africa. And remember, this was the mid-80s. The high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And I was allowed to give public lectures on these two scenarios. And a lot of people came up to me and said, how can Anglos spend money on spinning a fairy tale that the National Party will sit down with the ANC and negotiate a settlement? But of course it happened. And that's why you do scenarios. And it happened sooner than we thought. We kind of thought people would start being sensible by the mid-90s. But Nelson Mandela was released in 1990. I actually saw him in prison just before his release, because he'd read my book and he wanted to discuss the high road and low road scenarios. And I spent five hours with the great man in his cottage in the prison grounds. And yeah, it just showed the sheer power of scenario planning, because we didn't wave our finger and say, this is what you've got to do. We said, here are the scenarios. How can you make the good one happen? And how can you avoid the bad one? And that is the whole point of the process. And a big point we make in the new book is that in your personal life, that's the way you should look at the future, not by trying to forecast exactly what's going to happen, but weighing up different scenarios and saying, how can I avoid this one because it'll be unfortunate for me? And how can I pursue the good one? And so, yeah, it was the most amazing experience being involved in scenarios that actually changed the conversation in South Africa towards a much more positive one. Pierre actually said it was the finest exercise that he participated in his life, because, as he said, I try and change the mindset of a company. Here we are trying to change the mindset of a nation. And then when Pierre retired, I had the good fortune to write this book, The Mind of a Fox, with Chantal Ilbry, my co-author's mother. And in it, we introduced this whole thing of the hedgehog and the fox, where the hedgehog knows one big thing, according to the ancient Greek poet Archilochus, but the fox knows many things. And we thought this was just a wonderful way of contrasting the two ways of looking at the future, with forecasters, and particularly super forecasters, making one single projection of the future and then attaching a probability to that forecast of whether it'll come true or not, and foxes who look at multiple futures and then look at the flags as the future unfolds and give intuitive probabilities to the different scenarios. And we've always said that that is a much better way of handling the future, because it's not like science where you can repeat an experiment. The future is unique, and the most valuable futures to capture are the ones that are really unusual. Just like what happened over the last few days in Afghanistan. You could have captured that kind of situation in a scenario. But as everybody has said, from the White House to the US military to everybody else, they didn't forecast that it would happen. And that's why you have to do scenario planning. And one of the real points we make in the book in chapter 9, as Scott said, is you've got to think and do. It's no good just thinking and stroking your chin. There's a kind of tag team of thinking and doing. And, you know, it's essential that once you've gone through the scenarios, you decide what the best course of action is, and then you go ahead and implement it. And you could be wrong. And that's why, as we have in another chapter, you've got to consider Charles Darwin and his point about survival of the fittest. It means that you adapt your strategy if there are surprising things in the future. So it's an ongoing process. You must never stop thinking about the future, and then you must never stop adapting your actions as a result of your process of future thinking.
And before we get into these scenarios, there's one piece that I think is important in terms of people's understanding, and that's how you talk about flags. Now, I remember the first time, or one of the first times I heard you talk, and it resonated with me, where you spoke about the flag in Japan and how people were leaving golf clubs and how you saw that as a flag. I don't know if you just want to talk a little bit, because we're going to go through the scenarios now and we're going to look at flags. And I think it's important for people to understand the flag analogy before we go to the next slide.
Yeah, it's because, you know, a good futurist looks at the forces that are driving the present into the future. And the ones that are trends, which you can be fairly sure are going to happen, we call rules of the game, the kind of new rules of the game. And the ones that a whole bunch of different scenarios attached to them because they can go in different directions, we call key uncertainties. But we use the term flags. And that example of Japan, in 1988, Pierre Wack actually said, you know, Japan is no longer going to have an economic growth rate of 7 to 8%, which it had during the 1970s and during the 1980s, because the one flag that has gone up in Japan is that it's getting old, and people are resigning from golf clubs in Tokyo, and if that is really going to happen during the 1990s, that the nation is going to get older, then you have a completely new situation in Japan. But the other thing he said about the drop in golf membership is that it was the last thing that Japanese would do if they felt the situation was getting tighter. And at the time, property prices were at absurd levels in Japan. In fact, the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the entire state of California. And so he said, with this loss of golf club membership, will probably go a collapse in the property market. And it happened in 1990. And guess what? Because of the gray flag of the aging of the Japanese population, it is the oldest population on earth. And in fact, it's declining. The Japanese economy, ever since the early 90s, has grown at between 0.5% and 1%. So Pierre was not only right about the sort of trigger event of 1990, he was also right in terms of saying that Japan for the next, well, till now, 2021, would grow at a much slower rate economically than it did in the 70s and 80s. And that's what showed what a wonderful scenario planner he was, because, you know, occasionally you can get quite precise if you spot that line of causation between something absurd like decline in golf club membership and what actually happened, the property crash, and then Japan economy flattening out.
No, it's brilliant. I remember when I first heard it from you, I sort of used the analogy, because if you go to the beach in Cape Town, there's different flags. You know, if you've got a black flag, white flag, green flag, and basically if you don't know what the flags mean, then you're probably going to get eaten by a great white shark. So I tend to use the analogy because it was a little bit more real to me. But in simple terms, you know, what I love about the flags is that, you know, think of it like the sharks. And, you know, if you don't understand what the flags mean, you're either swimming with sharks or you're not swimming with sharks. So it's really good to know what the flags mean. So with that, let's move on, because we've got so many people from all over the world that have come here to really understand where we're at. And I think the one that most people probably want to start with is the various scenarios for the global economy. You know, when I looked at it and you know, over the different years I've heard you speak around the global scenarios, and even reading your book, you looked at the global environment, and we're going to go there. But I'd love to know what your thoughts are around the global economy. Most of the people that are on this webinar are investors, and they want to understand, you know, what should we be looking at as investors around the world?
Well, let me start with the religious flag. When Chantal and I wrote that book, The Mind of a Fox, in 2001, we included a letter to George Bush saying, if you want to be a fox, Mr. President, you must consider multiple futures. And we said that one of his key uncertainties at the time was the rising conflict between the major religions of the world that really started in the late 1980s between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, something that, you know, the world really hadn't seen in the last century until the 1990s. And we said that terrorist groups were getting more sophisticated, and with this growing collision between the major religions, it could lead to a massive terrorist attack on a Western city. And we published the book in June 2001. And in September the 11th, which we're about to have the 20th anniversary of, 9/11 happened. And I remember being rung up about 6 months after 9/11 by the State Department, the US State Department, who said, we've done a literature search, Mr. Sunter, and we found that yours is the only book in the world that captured the idea of a major terrorist strike on America. How come that two South Africans captured something that no intelligence agency in America captured? And I said, we didn't know it was going to happen 3 months after we published the book. We didn't know it was going to be New York. We didn't know that planes were going to fly into buildings. But it's rather like your example, Scott, of the shark flag. We knew the risk was rising. And that's the whole point about the work we do. It's not to get the future precisely right, but to get it vaguely right. And indeed, they did a congressional inquiry after the 9/11 event. And there was a young woman in the FBI who went to her boss on 6 occasions and said, boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off, but not land. And as we describe in this book, Thinking the Future, you have the broad general flag, which is the religious flag, and then you look for the critical sub-flags. And in this case, it was what this woman was talking about, having a couple of Arabs learning how to take off but not land at an American flying school. And if somebody was conscious of that first flag, they might have interpreted the second flag differently, which might have actually stopped 9/11 happen. In fact, in this book, we have that whole incident in January the 6th when there was the invasion of Capitol Hill, where we said it must have been obvious when Trump was giving that speech on the 6th, along with Giuliani, that something was going to happen. And yet the Capitol was totally unprepared for the march. And that's why you've got to have the kind of foxiness of a scenario planner to capture that. So the religious flag is still flying. You can see what happened over the last few days. The Taliban have retaken Afghanistan, and that's going to change the dynamic of the Middle East yet again. And so it is an important flag if you're an investor in any part of the world that is influenced by that particular flag. And obviously, one has to be on the watch all the time for possible terrorist events in Western cities. The second flag, which is really important and has again become very important, we call the red flag, because it's about the old communist world and 3 countries in particular, Russia, America, and Russia, China, and North Korea. In the case of Russia, there's a very tense relationship between Russia on the one hand and America and Europe on the other because of their annexation of the Crimea. And Russia provides 25% of Europe's energy needs. And so, you've got to watch that relationship very, very closely. And I'll be very interested to see how Russia now moves on the new situation in Afghanistan. But China is even more important because we say in this book that something is about to happen, maybe by the end of the 2020s, maybe it'll be in the 2030s, which is going to change the world from the one that existed in the last 300 years. Because the West has reigned supreme in the world. It was countries like Holland and Spain and other countries in the 16 and 1700s. Then it was Britain, and then, of course, America. But at some point in the next 20 years, China is going to overtake America to become the biggest economy in the world. And so the baton is moving east, and that changes everything. And you can see from what has happened in Afghanistan that we're moving into a post-American world. It doesn't matter what Joe Biden says. We're moving into this world where America, which is a democracy, is going to be replaced by China, which is an autocracy. They have totally different cultures. I mean, I've lectured on scenario planning at the Harvard Business School, but also at the Central Party School in Beijing, which is the innermost sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party. And I can't tell you how different the two are. I mean, when you go to the Central Party School, you drive up to the front of the school and you're met by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. And you kind of want to know that they're expecting you because they have guns. And yeah, we did this session on scenario planning in the school grounds, and it was just a totally different experience to Harvard. So it is going to be amazing that leadership position is going to be taken by a country which is culturally completely different to America and the West. And if anything showed that America is no longer the global cop that it was, it's what's happened in the last few days. And I think one of the reasons that America has withdrawn is not only obviously that American citizens have become fed up with being in other countries and losing American lives. It's because the American financial position is not what it was. I mean, the national debt of America is around $28 trillion at the moment, and is sort of being added to at the rate of $5 to $6 trillion a year. And their GDP is 23 billion. So if you look at that in percentage terms, national debt is around 120% of GDP. The last time America had that ratio over 100% of national debt to GDP was in 1946, just after the Second World War. And they got it all the way down to 30% in the 1960s, 70s. And now it's gone all the way back up again to 120%. So it is hugely significant that America is now, in global terms, definitely lagging, and China is stepping up to the plate. And every business and every investor in the world must work out exactly what that means. And I have to say that the events in Afghanistan must make some of the other countries protected by America quake in their boots. I mean, Germany, there are American troops there which guard them from the Russians. You have Taiwan and Australia, for that matter, who are protected by the American presence. South Korea is being protected from North Korea. And yeah, there are quite a few other countries which must be getting worried about the kind of, supremacy of America. And the third country in our red flag is North Korea. Despite all those photo shoots between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, nothing happened. No sanctions were lifted, and North Korea did not dismantle one nuclear weapon. The only thing that they did was less testing of missiles, which is a good thing, because people were very worried, particularly when they shot missiles over Japan. But, the red flag now has become much more important because of the decline in sort of supremacy of America. The third flag we've talked about, which is the gray flag of the aging of the world's population. As I said, Japan is the oldest country, but Europe is following suit. Italy has a declining population. Greece is the oldest population in Europe. The UK is an aging population. So as an investor, you've got to be aware that Europe is never again going to grow as fast as America because it's got an older population. And yes, you can make money in Europe because there's always new entrepreneurs with new companies. But generally speaking, the European economy is going to be stuck in the kind of groove of 0 to 2% economic growth because of the gray flag of the aging of the population. America's very lucky because it's had many more immigrants, and so it's a much younger and more resilient population, and the kind of natural economic growth rate of America is somewhere between 2 and 3%. China is getting middle-aged because of the one-child policy that they used to have. Now they've actually eliminated control of children altogether. They turned it into a two-child policy, but now you can have as many children as you like in China. But it doesn't stop their economy slowing down because they're becoming a middle-aged population. So one of the critical things to do as an investor in a country is to look at the demographics because it can really influence that country. The fourth flag is around social media and the kind of polarization of views that social media is leading to. I'm not in one way saying that we shouldn't have social media and all these wonders of modern technology. It's fantastic. But there is one consequence which is leading to much more disruption in the social dynamics of countries, which is that it's leading to people only looking at websites that agree with their views. So you don't get that kind of debate that you used to have. You have the lovers of Trump, you have the lovers of Joe Biden, and you have this kind of polarization. In the UK, someone like Boris Johnson used that kind of polarization when he pitted the north of England against the south to get the Brexit vote through. And so we're seeing much more populist politics happening around the world because of social media. And as we say in this book, it means that ordinary people can get together and do amazing things in that external circle of the world, which they don't control because of social media. It's meant the interaction between the world that you control and the world that you don't control has become much closer. And you can, through forming mass movements, change the world. And Greta Thunberg, when I get to the green flag, has done just that. So one's got to look at how this particular flag of the polarization of people is going to lead. And one of the most damaging consequences is that we live in a world where there are 8 billion people, very close to 8 billion. And it's created, social media has created this gilded cage mentality in the developed world, that they've got to put cages around countries in order to protect themselves from illegal immigrants. I did a session in 2012 with Interpol in Paris when we looked at the 10 greatest threats to the world over the next 10 years. And I was very surprised with what they chose as their number one threat, which was porous borders. The fact that, you know, people would be flooding into different countries. And the Americans who were at this conference talked about the Mexican borders, but of course the Europeans talked about the Mediterranean. And we're seeing that. I mean, there are record numbers of illegal immigrants trying to get into the UK. And so the response is the exact opposite of what we had in the previous century, which was globalization, freedom of movement of people and goods. Now we're seeing countries actually trying to restrict movement of people because they don't want to be overwhelmed. And that is a major new trend. And the last one I really want to talk about is the green flag, which we mention at length in this book, which is this whole thing about climate change and the environment. I mean, I've been talking about it for years, but the thing which I've picked up from most of the climate change experts that I know in the US and the UK is that things are happening much quicker than they anticipated earlier in this century. They thought stuff would happen in the 2050s and onwards if we didn't curb carbon emissions. But the kind of extreme weather events that we are now seeing it's happening right now. And since we wrote the book, you've had these massive floods in Germany, in Belgium, and in Holland as a result of excessive rainfall, and that's caused by the fact that the greater heat means more evaporation of water from the Earth's surface and clouds being able to hold more water, which then suddenly is released and causes 1 in 1,000-year rainfalls. China has just had a 1 in 1,000-year rainfalls. And of course now, in other countries, you had the exact opposite. These incredible fires in Turkey, in Greece, in Northern California. They've just had the biggest recorded fire on record. And so it's a kind of new world for investors, because very few investors have tried to figure out what impact can climate change have on their investments. But it's going to come. Certainly, there's I think this meeting in November in Glasgow, which is where all the world leaders are going to have a discussion about what to do. We're going to see a radical new order around trying to curb carbon emissions, and you then have to wonder what all those companies that use coal and use oil and all these things are going to do. But equally with property now, when I talk to on webinars with estate agents, I say you've got to be careful what you recommend to your clients, because maybe you've really got to consider whether you're offering a house which is in a potential flood zone that wouldn't have been a flood zone a few years ago, but now is because of the extreme weather. None of us have really worked out what the implications of this green flag are. And one final thing is the pandemic itself. We said in our letter to George Bush back in 2001 that one of the things which would happen, not necessarily on his watch, but at some stage in this century, would be another pandemic. And again, we couldn't possibly have said it would happen in 2020, but here we are. It's probably the biggest event of our lives in terms of the total lockdown of the global economy. It shows that you've got to play scenarios. There's no way that you could forecast what actually happened of empty streets and all the sort of economic disruption caused by the pandemic. And it's highly uncertain at the moment when it's going to end. I mean, it's fantastic that the vaccine companies came up with a solution so quickly. Usually it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine. They did it within 1 year, which was absolutely brilliant. And it's quite clear that vaccines now protect most people from going to hospital and dying. They don't protect you necessarily from being infected, but they protect you from the serious consequences of catching the virus, which is great. And so the world is beginning to pick up again, but we still don't know whether there are going to be other variants around. I mean, the Spanish flu 100 years ago killed 50 to 100 million people because a more lethal virus came about towards the end of the pandemic. I hope this isn't going to happen with this pandemic, but it just means that we live in a world of extreme uncertainty, and therefore your strategy of thinking about the future has to reflect that uncertainty.
Quick one, Clem. Let's go to, because you touched on it, and I'm jumping a little bit in the questions, but let's do it because you went to that, is the scenarios for the environment. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about the scenarios for the environment and South Africa. We'll go to South Africa next. But I've actually taken a little piece out of the book here just around kind of the environment and how important the environment is. Do you mind just touching a little bit on the different scenarios for the environment and why you believe it's so important? I presume that ties in with your green flag for the global scenarios.
Yeah, the virtuous one, the one that we should be aiming for, is we call paradise regained. To sort of quote John Milton, the British poet. Some people have questioned this title by saying we've never been in paradise, but what the heck? What we're meaning by this is that, the world works together, and particularly America and China work together because they are the largest 2 carbon emitters in the world. And, as I said, I've been pretty negative on what that relationship could be over the next 20 years, because China is about to overtake America to become the largest economy, and they are so different in culture. But one of the preconditions for the Paradise Regains scenario is similar to the pandemic. We've got to work together to get rid of it, and America and China must actually inspire the rest of the world with new technologies to reduce emissions and all that kind of stuff. And one of the points we make here is, in terms of that tag team of thinking and doing, every individual must actually look at their own carbon footprint and see what they can start cutting out to reduce their own personal footprint. We quote a statistic from the UN that the richest 1% of the world's population emit double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50% of the world's population. So, that richest 1% is going to have to come to the party. If they don't, then the worst case scenario we call pandemonium, because you're going to see climate refugees like you've never seen before, because sea levels are rising. There's a lot of coastal cities which will be impacted. In fact, the Dutch, when I did a session with them about 2 years ago, said that they're surprised that London hasn't actually put in place much better protection against rising sea levels. The Dutch know all about that with their dikes, but they said it's amazing how sort of England just doesn't see the threat at the moment. But of course, there are lots of islands which are going to be threatened in the middle of the ocean because of rising sea levels. And it's really happening. I mean, ask anybody who's familiar with the Arctic and the Antarctic and Greenland. I mean, billions of tons of ice now are melting every year into water, and that is raising sea levels. So, yeah, it's the pandemonium scenario is a really scary one, and in fact, as somebody said to me the other day, the Mexican border will become the Canadian border, because Americans will be fleeing from the impact of climate change north into Canada. Having said that, about a month ago, Vancouver had temperatures around 50 degrees centigrade, which is unbelievable. I mean, Canada has never had that before, and there we go. It is affecting everybody. We have in-between scenarios. We call one isolated Edens. It's where Scandinavian countries and others try to protect themselves from the kind of specter of climate change. And so, you do have some countries really trying to reduce their carbon emissions and keep their own environment safe. But of course, like the coronavirus, climate change is a global phenomenon. And if all countries don't come to the party, then, you know, we face this terrible scenario for our children and grandchildren of pandemonium. And, you know, that has never happened before in global history. But we have 8 billion people on the planet now. The projection is 10.5 billion by the turn of the century. And if they're trying to search for a place to live, it's going to be a very, very difficult world.
Just as my interest, do you provide scenarios in terms of predictability, you know, of what you put Paradise Regained at the moment, just as an example in terms of where we're at? Do you actually do that, or?
Yeah, and we've got a whole chapter, as you said, by Karl Popper. Karl Popper was a scientific philosopher who said, in this world you have clocks and clouds. And what he meant by clocks and clouds was clocks were fairly predictable systems, just like you can look into a clock and you'll see all the workings of the clock, and then you have a good idea of how the clock will behave. And as we know, it regularly ticks away. So he feels that there are phenomena in the world that are like clocks. And then he said there are phenomena like clouds where you have no idea what the shape of the cloud will be, you know, later in the day, let alone whether it'll be there tomorrow. And so the world is a mixture of certainty of clocks and the uncertainty of clouds. And we've said, you know, that this spectrum that exists can be applied to scenario planning, where after you've done the scenarios, you should look at the flags which really are relevant for each of those different scenarios. And then based on the flags and whether they're going up or down and whether they're red or green flags, you then give an intuitive probability to the scenario, not a mathematical probability, because the future only happens once. So this idea that you can calculate a mathematical probability, which some, you know, very popular futurist books say you can do. We just don't agree with that at all. You can give an intuitive probability based on the clocks and clouds. And if I was to give an intuitive probability between Paradise Regained and pandemonium at the moment, I would kind of have 50-50, because I haven't seen any action being taken, real action being taken, to lower the prospect of the pandemonium scenario caused by climate change. And that's why this conference in November in Glasgow is absolutely critical. In fact, this book, Thinking the Future, we've asked the WWF whether they can actually distribute it at the conference, so that you know, we make people aware of these scenarios, because, you know, we want them to concentrate, not just have another great sort of political get together and come up with some feel good statements at the end. This is for real, and it's going to affect not only our lives, but in the end, it'll affect the markets and everything else. It's probably the biggest crisis we face in the world's history, because it's never happened before this.
Yeah, you talk in the book, which I love, is the analogy, and I forget her name right now, but the New Zealand lady who was the prime minister, and when they had the terrorist attack, how quickly she acted.
Ardern, yeah.
Yes, and how quickly she acted, and then when they had the coronavirus pandemic, again, how quickly she acted. And you talk about the environment, and I think this is the problem, is that because it's a slow burner, people don't react, because there's not like one major thing that suddenly, you know, there's not like a 9/11 that gets everyone excited. So, you know, maybe providing your book at the conference later in the year, you know, can at least get people to start thinking, you know, in terms of those, you know, intuitive probabilities. And more importantly, it comes back to me a reminding of the 1962 version of it, where it was this apocalyptic, is that the right word, future of nuclear war, and people realizing like this is real. We need to start taking this seriously, you know.
Yeah, and I have to say that you know, you're quite right about the slow nature of this threat. As we say in the book, we're very bad at capturing the slow-moving flags or the distant flags. Most people have no idea of the Arctic or the Antarctic and the fact that they're melting because they live, thousands of miles away. And so the only way you're going to capture people's imagination is to write the kind of movie script scenarios that we recommend in this book. If you just put forward a document full of statistics and the fact that the world could warm up by another 0.5 degree centigrade over the next 20 years, that's not going to inspire anybody. You've actually got to show them kind of movie script scenarios of the good and the bad, and then say, you choose.
No, I love that. So let's just a quick question that I wanted to ask before we move on. Your intuitive probabilities for the global economy from a scenarios perspective. What are they looking like? You gave us the 5 flags in terms of the religious flag, the red flag, the green flag, the social media, the pandemic, etc., the gray flag, etc. But what are the intuitive probabilities from a global scenario, global economy?
Well, let's look at a bit of recent history. The global economy did very well in the latter part of the last century. There was a period of high inflation in the 1980s, but globalization, meant that the global economy could grow, somewhere between 5 and 10% per annum. And at the beginning of this century, it continued because of the fact that the population growth was there, and younger continents like Africa were just entering the market. And then, of course, we had the financial crash of 2008. And, that basically stopped the global economy in its tracks. And yes, the markets recovered very quickly after 2008, and the super rich went back to being super rich. But for the middle class and the working class of the world, which is the bulk of the world's population, it's been much tougher since 2008, even before the pandemic started in 2020. It was a tougher world. And yes, there are certain countries that have done exceptionally well. But it's been much more the case of actually picking the winners from the losers in terms of countries. Let me give you one statistic. Right now, I can't say right now because I didn't watch the close of the market. The FTSE is around 7,200. You know what the FTSE 100 was on December the 31st, 1999? It was 6,950. So in 21 years, the FTSE has gone up 250 points on 6,950. And yes, you've had the dividends, and in fact, the dividend yield of FTSE companies is higher than America. It's around about 3.5%, 4%, as opposed to America, which is 2%. So you've made some money out of dividends. But can you imagine anybody in 2000 predicting that over 21 years, the FTSE would go up 250 points? But that just shows how tough the global economy has been. The only stock markets that have done well collectively have been, of the developed world, is America and Germany. Both those stock exchanges have done relatively well.
And so, in terms of intuitive probability, is there any probability to give us there, or should we move on to South Africa?
Well, let's look at the scenarios first. Moving away from the environmental scenarios, I guess the two scenarios in play, which we mentioned to George Bush in the letter we wrote in The Mind of a Fox, was Friendly Planet, where you continue with freedom of movement of people and goods and all the good things, and we get new technologies coming along which stimulate the global economy. And one of the big things we picked up in those global scenarios of the 1980s was that it's waves of technology that cause new waves of global economic growth. So, I mean, at the time, it was, you know, the big computers which were contributing to economic growth in the 80s. And of course, the whole revolution around social media and micro devices has been another huge gain in technology, which has been, you know, relatively good for economic growth now. So, you know, watching the new technology flag is essential to, you know, writing good and bad scenarios for global economic growth. And yeah, we called one of the scenarios in the letter to Bush Friendly Planet. It's where, you know, we continue to have competition between nations, but, you know, it's essentially more globalization. And the second scenario we call Gilded Cage. And as I said, because of the kind of, you know, illegal immigration going on, and obviously the pandemic itself, I know that you got into Switzerland fairly easily, but, you know, lots of Western countries, it's very difficult to travel into at the moment. And so, you know, that Gilded Cage scenario is very much in play. And yeah, are we going to get back to a friendlier planet? I don't know. And I guess rather like those environmental scenarios, you know, I would kind of give an equal balance to the two scenarios, in which case, you know, as a fox, I would recommend that you've got to have a diversified portfolio.
Excellent. Well, music to my ears. We'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of a diversified portfolio. Yeah, it's interesting. Just to put a caveat to getting into Switzerland, I did get in easily, but I do have a European passport, so it's makes life a hell of a lot easier to get into the Gilded Cage if you're one of the canaries allowed in. Let's move to a country that I and you are both passionate about. As you mentioned earlier in the introduction, you know, you did scenarios, you worked with Nelson Mandela, and obviously there's been a lot of talk. And, you know, I've got two questions here. One is, in the book, interestingly enough, you go through various scenarios for South Africa, and then I've actually taken some of those scenarios, and there's even a question I've got later, which is there a future for us in South Africa? And, you know, and what's interesting is that it's phenomenal. You've either been incredibly lucky over the years, Clem, or you're incredibly good. And let me explain myself, because you wrote the book and 2 months later you had 9/11 and everyone was like, wow, this is amazing. And then the book became popular in Mind of the Fox. And you wrote this book and it literally just came out, and then we had all the looting and the riots, and now everyone's like, what the hell is going on in South Africa? And yet you actually had already spoken about it. So talk to us about our beloved country, and what are the scenarios and flags, and what do we need to know in this country?
Well, let me start by, if I can find it, I may not be able to find it. Here, it's really this whole point about, you know, laying the context for South Africa. And this was what we said as one of the rules. We said South Africa right now stands at an economic crossroads after years of corruption and state capture, combined with the disruptive impact of COVID-19. The treasury is virtually empty, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. We are at a tipping point where the path we take in the immediate future could define our future for decades. And then we offer two scenarios for South Africa. And the first one we call People's Economy, to convey the message that the work achieved by Nelson Mandela and others before and after the dawn of South Africa's democracy constitutes unfinished business. In this sequel to the watershed event that was the 1994 general election, the country now achieves economic freedom for all as a necessary complement to political freedom. The government creates an inclusive economy with a new generation of young entrepreneurs at the helm. The second scenario we call Cautionary Tale. Here, South Africa experiences rising popular anger caused by an economy that is stagnant, exclusive, and cursed by a dismally high unemployment rate. This leads to further disunity, and widespread violence with a possible endpoint of total anarchy in the chain of causation. And yes, you're quite right, within a month, well, in fact, this book's only been out since the beginning of July. So within about 2 weeks of writing this book, we had that looting and destruction. And, you know, it really shows why you have to do scenarios. Because if we'd said, oh, well, here's our forecast for South Africa, that doesn't really impinge on anybody's mind. But certainly in all the webinars I've done recently, and certainly post the looting, it really does chime with people that we are at a tipping point, and we either go the route of a people's economy or we head into the cautionary tale. And one of the reasons we put so much emphasis on entrepreneurs is that the world of work has changed. That's another flag. In the last century, big business was the major creator of jobs. And all you had to do at school or university was get a good pass or degree and wave your CV in front of a big company and you get a job. But automation and robots and artificial intelligence have destroyed hundreds of thousands of jobs in big business. So the major creator of jobs in the world today is small business. I mean, we quote the statistic in the book that in America, the Small Business Association there says that 2/3 of American jobs are being created in small business. Not in government, not in big business, in small business. And so given that rule of the game, the only way we're going to get our hideous unemployment rate of 35% down to an acceptable level of, say, 5% or less is by creating a people's economy and concentrating on small business. So when we talk about the flags associated with the people's economy, we say, number one, Cyril should set up an entrepreneurship council, just like he's got a coronavirus council at the moment, with experts and particularly entrepreneurs who've founded businesses, like Adrian Gore founded Discovery. And they come up with a practical set of steps that can be taken to free up our economy and help entrepreneurs grow their businesses from micro enterprises into small to medium sized enterprises. For example, we think that every large company in South Africa should assign at least 20% of its supply chain to nurturing small business. We did that in Anglo-American in the 1990s with a project called Zimeli. We looked underground at all the stuff we were using for our safety and obviously to mine the rock. And we identified things that could be manufactured by small business. And then we went and found young entrepreneurs. We helped them with our advice and with finance. And now they're thriving businesses. And we think that should be another step taken towards an entrepreneurial economy. The banks should be putting together a micro lending institution for rural areas. And maybe the banks should be doing it together, rather like in Bangladesh. There's the Grameen Bank, which has been set up for micro enterprise. And then maybe every city in South Africa should have an e-stock exchange, you know, the equivalent of eBay, except that you can float your company on the site and offer, you know, a percentage of the equity to the public and get crowdfunding. So it's a radical new idea that we're promoting in this book. I did a debate with Julius Malema back in 2016 at the Cape Sun. It was for the Cape Chamber of Commerce. And it was a dinner, and I must say he was a very genial person to debate with. But I said to him, I'm as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. You concentrate on the government taking over the land and maybe the mines and other things. I concentrate on what can you do to empower ordinary people to set up their own businesses. Because given the changing nature of work, it is the only way we are going to resolve the problem of unemployment in our country.
It's amazing. I've actually done a bit of a cheat sheet for people on what you're talking about with the scenarios, the rules, and the flags. One thing that I just thought was a little bit interesting, I think some of them are fairly self-explanatory: performance of state-owned enterprises around infrastructure, education, and health, the Gini coefficient. You've spoken about big business and e-stock exchanges. I do find it funny that as a fintech platform, I completely agree with you with equity crowdfunding, and we were actually the very first company and platform in Africa to get a crowdfunding license in December last year. It took us only 10 years though. And I love what you were saying. In America, they roll out the red carpet for entrepreneurs, and in Africa, they roll out the red tape. Well, it took us 10 years. And then law and order, violent crime, I think is fairly self-explanatory. But the one I'd like to just ask a question on this is around land expropriation and how you said that there needs to be redistribution of land, but while keeping food security in place. And I think because it's quite a contentious issue at the moment that people need to understand. And I'd love you just to give a bit more context to that.
Yeah, my point is this, that farming has changed. If you look around the world, it's become a much bigger business. Interestingly, we talked about small business, but yes, you still have market gardens and all the stuff that takes place around cities. But in America, in the UK, here, that it's the big farms that are the sort of super food producers supplying the big stores like Pick and Pay and ShopRite and Checkers. And I guess you could possibly say 20% of the farming operations in South Africa supply 80% of the food. And the last thing you want to do is to meddle in any way, in negative way, with those particular operations. So I've always said the kind of solution we should be looking at is what we've done in big business, which is to try and widen share ownership. I mean, that you do have employee share ownership schemes. We have it in Anglo, but other companies have employee share ownership schemes. Maybe farmers should be thinking of employee share ownership schemes, so that it's not hands off my farm, it's hands off our farm. And I know one or two farmers in the Eastern Cape, including the largest dairy farmer in South Africa, who have done just that. But equally, I sort of implore Cyril and the government to stop talking about expropriation without compensation, because it's such a negative term to use. What they should be looking is at taking over land which is empty at the moment, particularly around municipal areas, and turning it into, something creative, or turning it into additional land for homes. But that's the point I try and make in the book, that it's got to be very pragmatic, because it is an exceptionally sensitive issue. And if we start going in any way down the Zimbabwean route of what happened there, then, you as we have seen with the kind of looting and destruction that we had in South Africa, and now what you're seeing in Afghanistan, things can happen very, very quickly. So, it's a huge point that we've got to tackle this sensitive issue, but it's got to be done in a way that actually gets full cooperation from the farming sector.
No, brilliant. Well, look, I mean, the book is very explicit. There's a huge amount of information. Like I said, I tried to create a cheat sheet. So let's get onto your intuitive probabilities. And the great question that many people will be asking is there a future in South Africa, between the people's economy and the second scenario? What are we looking at, and what do you think? I've given the flags for everybody. Here it all is between the people's economy.
Well, when I wrote the book, it was a kind of 60 people's economy, 40 to the cautionary tale. maybe even 70-30 people. So, because I do feel that, Cyril is trying to do the right things. However, the looting and destruction, I immediately, that event, and we didn't know at the time that it wouldn't go on. Thank heavens that the looting was followed by the very positive event of cleanup by the community, and also protection of assets by community. So you saw firstly the worst side of South Africa and then the best side of South Africa. And so I've reverted to, thinking that, we certainly have the right spirit to create the people's economy. And I don't sure that I go on about it in the book, but if you look at the great countries of the world, it's not the politicians who create the great countries, it's the entrepreneurs. Why is America the economic superpower? It's because of, the Fords, the Ford family, and then Walt Disney and then Bill Gates and then Steve Jobs. It's these people that create really successful economies. And it's something I know from having done a few lectures in Singapore, that they're very keen there on having an education system that stresses entrepreneurship, because they know that the only way that small city state of Singapore is going to be a world beater is through developing entrepreneurs.
Yeah, look, I'm going to read that a little bit later, literally straight out of the book. But my takeaway as a South African was that I can either go and overseas and complain about the problem, or as an entrepreneur I can be part of the solution. And I suppose we all get to choose. So if you don't mind, I'm conscious of time, and so I want to do some kind of rapid fire kind of questions, just really on again using your intuitive thinking. But if I was to look here in terms of the best place to invest in the moment around the world, based on all your scenarios, environmental, everything else, what do you think? And again, this is not advice in any way. It's just a gut feel, basically.
Yeah. Look, my point is, firstly, it's the business that counts. So even in fairly negative territories, you can have incredible businesses. So that comes first of all. But I guess I go back to my grey flag. There's no doubt that European companies are probably going to battle for high economic growth rates. Well, the big ones are, not the small ones, which are entrepreneurial and growing their markets. And of course, the same goes for Japan. So, my favorite is still America, even though it's going to, move below China. I'm worried about China, obviously, at the moment, like everybody is, with the way the government there is moving against big tech. It's the first time I've kind of seen the Chinese Communist Party sort of veering away from the kind of belief system of Deng Xiaoping. I mean, it was quite interesting when I went to the Central Party School in 2006. I was shown around the place afterwards because very few foreigners actually visit the school. And in the classrooms, all the quotes of Mao Zedong had been taken down and replaced by slogans of Deng Xiaoping. And I asked one of the professors why, and he said, because Deng taught us two things. He said the government should concentrate on infrastructure, quality of infrastructure, education, and health. And the second thing is that ordinary Chinese people should be allowed to create wealth for themselves. And he said at the time we were the 100th ranked economy in the world, and now we're number 5, and of course now they're number 2. And I must say that recent events in China have slightly worried me, that the Communist Party there is more concerned with sustaining its power and authority than it is with meeting Deng's second point, which is allowing Chinese entrepreneurs to do their own thing. Other countries, well, there's plenty of investment opportunities in Africa, and places like Namibia and Botswana, they're very stable. They have good opportunities. I know they're small economies. India is definitely growing, but you have to understand the Indian economy and probably be in partnership with somebody there. And yes, here in South Africa, there's a lot of good investment opportunities, particularly in small to medium-sized businesses, because we do have a lot of good entrepreneurs here. I mean, after all, the second richest man in the world, Elon Musk, was educated at Pretoria Boys High.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. Okay, let's move to this one. In terms of the best asset classes, you've actually spoken about quite a lot of this tonight in terms of stock markets and properties. Any other thoughts around just asset classes in general with the scenarios you've outlined?
Well, my view when I talk of diversification is obviously in terms of the broad asset classes of how much money should you have in stocks, how much should you have in property, how much should you have in cash, and obviously which currencies should you hold. I mean, funny enough, my father was a stockbroker in London. In fact, he had the Prudential as one of his chief clients, and he had this principle of having a third in property, a third in equity, a third in cash. And every 5 years, he'd readjust. So if he'd done well in equities, he went back to a third. And if he'd done well in properties, he went back to a third. And he did exactly what Warren Buffett, I guess, would do, which is, you sell when other people are being greedy, and you buy when other people are fearful. And it worked very well for him. But obviously you've got to be diversified geographically, and you've got to be diversified in asset categories.
Yep, no, brilliant. I love one of the people that I follow most, through the last couple of years has been Ray Dalio, and Ray Dalio talks a lot about diversification across countries, assets, currencies, and even partners. In terms of where the world is. Let's look at this one, and it's one that I took what I found interesting, and you've already alluded to it in terms of the wealth gap. But you spoke about the quality of the world's poverty-stricken inhabitants has been really, really difficult. You've spoken about 2,153 billionaires currently have the same as 60% of the world's population. And you've actually mentioned tonight already around the average middle-class family in countries is worse off today than 2007. I did find this statistic very interesting. In 2020, Oxfam highlighted that the monetary value of unpaid care workers globally by girls and women aged 15 and over is at least 10.8 trillion, 3 times the yearly revenue of the world tech industry. And then lastly, so just talk to us a little bit around this wealth gap and this Gini coefficient. A lot of people think it's a South African problem, but it's a worldwide problem. And, the UN 2030 as the Sustainable Development Goals actually had it as their #1 challenge.
Yeah, no, look, it's been highlighted in quite a few books that global inequality is now reaching an all-time high. It was very high in the last century, round about sort of 1914 in the Edwardian era. It was there were just a few rich people and a lot of poor people. And then the First World War and the Second World War destroyed a lot of the wealth of the super rich. And then coming out of the Second World War, we had globalization, and the sort of global equality index was very good in the 1970s, and inequality had reached a minimum. But ever since the mid 70s, early 80s, the return on capital employed has been higher than wage increases. And so that gap has widened again. And then, of course, we had the financial crash of 2008, and that widened it even more, particularly by 2012 when the markets were back again. And I think the pandemic has done the same, is that the super rich have done very well out of their stocks, because as we know, the American market is at a record high. But there are a lot of ordinary people, particularly in the service industries and in hotels and tourism, who've actually done terribly over the last 18 months because they just haven't had the business. And yes, that kind of scenario of the sort of poor struggling while the markets are at a record high does not bode well for the kind of cooperative spirit one's looking for to lead to the recovery of the global economy. I mean, I've forgotten what the statistic is, but it's something like the richest 26 people on earth, or something like that, have as much wealth as the poorest 50%. I mean, 26 people isn't that many people. So, it's not going to go away. And of course, the rage that a lot of people feel is now channeled into social media, and that's why we have a problem.
No, 100%. Well, look, I'm going to talk a little bit, and that's why I brought up the wealth movement. This one I just wanted to mention very quickly, because I love, we've spoken about the pandemic, and as a fox, you can adapt to thrive in harsh times rather than merely survive. And you spoke a lot about here of different things people can do, how they can, thinking about how to turn their events into wider networking exchange, how to rearrange my life to make my home more interesting for me and my family. What new social activities can I establish to add richness to public life after the pandemic? Post-pandemic scenarios will include quick and slow recoveries in your home country and the world as a whole, besides adjusting their spending habits depending on the economic progress. Innovative South Africans should be conscious of the cautionary tale because of the pandemic's disproportionate impact on the lives of poorer citizens. How will they ask? Well, they must roll up their sleeves and shift the odds back to the people's economy scenario, both in our community and in South Africa at large. What we've learned from Darwin is the adaptability is the key survival as a species. As human beings, although we need more than survival, we want happy, fulfilling lives. Adaptation has been combined with with our ability to respond to the future, and you can take full advantage of it. Now, I just love what you spoke in here about teamwork and how important teamwork is to create social change, and how innovation and foxes, smell the opportunity and take that one extra step to succeed. I don't know if you did anything on that. I just thought I would highlight some of those things, because again, I really enjoyed the book and highly recommend it. But there's almost like a playbook on how to survive and not only survive but thrive in the pandemic.
Well, of course, the pandemic is itself, it's going to be those entrepreneurs who spot the kind of differences in our lifestyle. And I do think that more people are going to work from home and lead mixed lives. I don't think we're ever going to go back to exactly the same lifestyle as pre the pandemic. And it's going to be those people who spot the changes and obviously how to make money out of those changes in collective behavior, who are going to do very well. And a lot of those changes are going to be in the kind of digital world, like the webinar we're doing right now. There's going to be lots of people continuing to do webinars because they find it's a much cheaper way of bringing people together than getting them to fly to a particular city and stay in a hotel and do all that kind of thing. Not that it'll go away completely, because there's always the social dynamics of face-to-face meetings, but we're going to see some kind of hybrid developing, I think.
No, brilliant. This one is one that I love, and you spoke a lot about Nelson Mandela and Steve Jobs and thinking and doing, and how sort of a lot of people have great ideas but don't actually go out there and do them. Now, I'm not gonna give away the secrets, but you've put in here 5 different things that entrepreneurs can actually do, and whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're actually a company, and in terms of actually achieving it. And I just thought it was really, really fascinating for people, to look at this and to understand as a playbook. I don't know if you want to talk to it, or I should leave it as a surprise for people that read the book.
Well, no. Let me talk a little bit about it. I mean, the first entrepreneurial rule is to discover what your own strengths are, so that you can create a team to offset your weaknesses. And that's one of the reasons we included Steve Jobs as a giant of this chapter, because with Wozniak, he was very good because he loved beautiful things. That was the thing about old Steve. He loved creating beautiful things, but he realized that a lot of the kind of technology, particularly at the micro level, was beyond him. So he managed to make sure the team that he had in Apple, particularly when he became CEO for the second time and produced the iPod, the iPad, and all the other things. He made sure that the team made up for the weaknesses that he recognized in himself. And then the second rule is obviously to turn defeat into victory by learning from your mistakes. And Jobs learned from his mistakes when he was first at Apple. And I mean, some people don't know that he actually left Apple and spent quite a few years in the wilderness before joining them a second time. And he did much better the second time around because he'd learned about his mistakes. And then the third rule is just being ahead of the market. And he was always ahead of the market. He said, get closer than ever to your customers, so close that you tell them what they need before they realize it themselves. The fourth rule is that innovation requires financial risks. And so you've got to be very careful in terms of when you outlay money and how much you outlay, because particularly when you're starting a business, there's huge risks involved. So, you've got to weigh up those financial risks versus the kind of innovative path you want to take. And then the last point, and it's not a rule, but it's one that we quoted in the book. He lived his job superbly when he appeared on TV in his Nike shoes, and he had classic Levi jeans and all these kind of things. He was the kind of embodiment of what he represented, and so that's what we feel a successful entrepreneur should do, and that's why we have those rules of the game in the book.
Awesome, because you talk about the critical interplay between thinking and doing, and for us mere mortals, you also said here that many people live a life that they don't intend to, blundered into via a series of thoughtless decisions. And I think one of the takeaways for me of the book is that this is not only about the Steve Jobs and the Nelson Mandelas, but each and every individual on this webinar is the captain or the leader of their own life. And even to the end here, you said as an entrepreneur is that you're going to give up resources, and it won't only be money, it will be time, and time is more precious than money. And I love that interplay because I think it's so important. Could I move to the last one, which I love, and it's the future of education. And it's interesting in the book you finish off with education, and you also talk about education being the number one flag for any one country. So anywhere, and as an investor and or as a person looking to go and live in a country or stay in a country or put your children into school or university, you talk about this flag of education. Now, we don't have time tonight to go into this in a huge amount of detail, but I'd just like to kind of get an overview of why you believe education is so important, not only to an economy, but as a flag.
We thought we won't end with the usual chapter summarizing the book. We'll end with a chapter really looking at the future. So we called it Planting Seeds, and it's all about education, and it's based on a fairly large digital workshop that Mitch had with his mother last year, with educational experts from other African countries, South Africa, from the UK, and one or two European countries. And they basically said there are two real uncertainties concerning the future. The first is making education relevant, and obviously for the changing job market, making it more entrepreneurial. And the second one revolves around the culture of the people involved in making the major decisions, particularly the principals of the schools. And that created four scenarios. And the first one we call bad to great, where you combine a cultural shift amongst teachers with the kind of technologies now available to improve learning. And it might mean that you don't have schools all on, in one place like you have at the moment, where, everything's the buildings, the sports grounds, they're all in one place. Maybe you can think of a more diversified model. Obviously, you've still got to have that social contact, because I know from this pandemic that a lot of kids, when they've had distance learning, they've really missed not being able to interact with their friends. So, how do you find the balance between technologies and and obviously teaching all the other social skills that you should to kids? So that's a good scenario. We call it bad to great. Then we have the one step forward, two steps back scenario, where, despite all the advances in technology, you still have the old-fashioned teachers who really don't want to change the model at all. And in fact, what came across to Mitch is that a lot of the educational experts say that this is a huge impediment at the moment, that there are a lot of people who do not want to change the model. And so one of the kind of recommendations of the workshop was that you should think of getting some younger teachers into the system who understand the essential need to marry technology with a new curriculum. The third scenario we called up the wrong tree. It's where you have all the technologies, you put them in, but they're not relevant. You haven't actually changed the education system and the curriculum to one that is suitable for the 21st century market. So yes, you've got all the technology in place, you've changed people's culture, but you're just going up the wrong tree. And the last scenario we call plucked ostrich, and it's where you simply don't change the culture and you ignore the technology. And I guess it's rather like the pandemonium scenario in climate change. It's the worst case scenario. And we just thought it was a highly relevant example to use to illustrate why you should do scenarios rather than forecasting what the future holds.
And obviously, down to your intuitive probabilities, this is not only a global thing, but becomes far more relevant at every country level. I want to finish with one quote that you've got here in the book around effective thinking. And it says, effective thinking, the future, to make better decisions in an uncertain and ever-changing world, is the number one skill that young people need today. In fact, that everyone needs. This core skill is central to so many aspects of our lives: planning for yourself, your family, and your business, engaging with others, navigating relationships, choosing where to invest your time and money, and of course, chasing your dreams. When you're young and you're old, effective future thinking can play a role in every decision you make and is critical to successfully managing these different dimensions to your life. And Clem, I just wanted to say that it's been an honor and a privilege to go through, firstly, to be able to read the book in so much detail. I highly, highly recommend it for everyone. But equally tonight, to go through it and to get some context and to, from yourself, I really appreciate it. And what I would appreciate, if you don't mind, and I'm conscious of the time here, it's been fascinating getting this information from you, is I wanted to just run through a little bit of a sequence of what we're going to be doing with Wealth 5.0, and then come back, and if people have Q&A, if you don't mind, we can just see if we can do 10 minutes of Q&A also. Would that suit you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Excellent. So let me just pivot very quickly in terms of how to move forward. the number one thing is go out to the bookstore and buy the book, Thinking the Future. As I said, my copy is looks like it's been through the mill. It's got notes and paper notes and everything all over the place. Also, if you want to be part of the change, go out, and there's a great book I read on creating a movement, and we've got the wealth movement, and it's out there to try and help solve the wealth gap, and we've built solutions around how to do that. For those of you,
can I just say, Scott, that you can get it on Kindle. We've actually been number 2 in the category of business planning and forecasting worldwide on Amazon Books. Because the Kindle version of the book is available on Amazon. Yeah.
Oh no, that's brilliant. Okay, thanks for letting us know, because I know that you also said that Penguin Books has been surprised by the demand and has been trying to keep up in the bookstores. So
they've in fact just done a reprint of the book. They said it's amazing that in 1 month they've had to reprint the book. Yeah.
Oh, well, it's brilliant. Well, as I said, 5 lucky participants are going to get a signed copy. We spoke all night about effective thinking and getting the right information and making sure that you don't go through life as a blinkered racehorse looking straight in front of you. Take the blinkers off and see the future around you. And that's why we do these webinars and Wealth 5.0. We've got a full schedule coming up in September, late August, September, and October. We're going to be looking at the top trends for 2021 and 2022 and beyond, and what investors should be focusing on. We're going to be looking at NFTs, if you don't know what they are, non-fungible tokens, what they're all about. Then the 16 macro trends, which are intersecting to create a generational opportunity in this decade. Why EdTech and FinTech markets are the 2 markets which are getting the most momentum with regards to IPO, and how wealth is being created with new funding models. Kathy Wood, that's one of the most successful venture capitalists in America, and why she's so successful for investing in high growth technology companies, and what you can learn and copy from her. And then finally, one that's close to my heart is impact investing, how to make a profit while living in a life of purpose and leaving a legacy. So Lee, if you don't mind, if you can just put up the link, because people will be able to go and participate in those. We've spoken a lot tonight about diversity as well. And with our business model, we've created a solution where people very simply can get access to quality partners around the world, England, Australia, America, Europe, where they list their properties or their alternative investments on the platform. You and I, as global investors, get access to them, and then we can invest on the platform. And there's literally 4 simple steps. You sign up, you complete your profile, you fund your wallet, and you invest. And if you look at it, you go to the platform, you sign up and click the terms and conditions like any other platform in terms of the process. You would then go through, and you only have to do this the first time, but you have to choose what country you come from and what type of investor you are. It's a self-certification from a compliance perspective. You would then go through and you would verify your account, and you would set yourself up with your profile and your KYC, which is know your client. It's fairly intuitive, and it'll take you through the process, and it's all digital and online. It takes about a day or 2, and it's global regulation. There's no way around it in terms of setting yourself up. The nice thing is you can set yourself up in your personal name or in a company or offshore investment. Then you want to go and upload all the documents. It's all online and makes it really easy for yourself. You then move to step 3, which is where you fund your wallet. We've got a digital wallet. We've partnered with Lemonway, which is the biggest digital wallet provider in Europe. Billions of dollars. Your money's protected by European law. And on top of that, it's actually backed by the top 5 banks. And funny enough, it's why I'm in Zurich tonight, because I'm on my way to Paris to go and meet the CEO tomorrow. But what I love about this is if you want to truly diversify and you don't want complexity in your life, this is a way to simply and safely do it. You don't have to worry about offshore structures, tax, bank accounts, or anything. You can invest all over the world. Your money comes back into your digital wallet. There's no costs, and you can diversify across countries, assets, currencies, and even partners. And then finally, you go and you actually browse the marketplace. And this is an example of a deal we did with John Raby in Portugal. This is a structured note in the alternative investment space. You can actually go through, you can read all about it, you can see all the returns, you can see the risk categories, you can read about all the risks and download the documents, you can put in all the returns calculators, so you've got complete transparency. Our core 3 values are trust, transparency, and alignment. So you know what the fees are. There's no hidden fees and and stuff being put into the platform. And then finally, once you want to actually invest in a platform, or sorry, in a property or an alternative investment, you literally can go in. Once you've funded your wallet, you can literally fill in the details. You automatically digitally sign the documents. And what you're watching someone here in less than a minute is actually go and invest in Portugal. And whether it was Portugal, England, Germany, America, Australia, you can actually do it all in one place, which I truly believe is how the world has now dramatically changed. We've got members in 164 countries. We've done over $100 million through the platform, and we've won numerous different awards, which are, just to give people confidence that they're not doing it on their own. And really, as an investor, you get to choose. We've spoken quite a lot about diversification tonight. You can go and invest in different platforms all over the world. But just like Uber, I don't want to catch a different Uber in every, different city. This morning I caught Uber here in Zurich. I've got everything all in one place. Our philosophy was, why not have one platform where I can invest around the world and manage my money simply and safely in one place?
But you have to do that because
I wanted to share this very quickly, and this will be interesting for you as well, Clem. This guy is also a futurist. He's currently listing his company on the New York Stock Exchange, which is an ed tech platform. And he was just talking for a minute here about the future of property.
But you have to do that because the democratization of real estate is going to be the biggest change that happens in fintech beyond anything else, in terms of it's going to disrupt more than the banking system. It's going to disrupt more than what's happening with stocks and shares. It's going to disrupt because basically property is the one last non-distributed asset. I mean, that's just the basics. It's like the process to buy a property is the most ridiculous thing ever, if you actually think about it. And it could be as easy as basically buying a stock or a share, right? And that's what is going to happen for sure.
So this is Roger James Hamilton, and he'll be one of the presenters in the Wealth 5.0 discussions. And so that's what it's all about. It's taking a lot of what Clem's talking about with the different scenarios and adapting it from an investment perspective and looking at how you actually, to be foxy, you need to have the information, but you not only have to have the knowledge, but you actually have to do something about it. And we'll go into it in more detail. The final slide that I wanted to share, the final two slides that I wanted to share, was that what we built was a platform in the middle. We came out with a global marketplace real estate for Wealth Migrate. We then brought out the Wealth University and the Wealth Movement. We listed Wealth China, Genius U, the company that's currently IPOing, and Zuza, which is a local platform. We've done Cashbox and a Private Wealth Global, which is our premium brand. We're about to launch Wealth South Africa, a Sharia compliance solution, Women in Wealth, and then Wealth India. So that's going to keep us busy for the next 2 years or so, next year to 12 to 18 months. But with time, it'll be all the regions around the world in terms of diversification and personalization, and ultimately getting it down to $1 per investor per investment. And what I always offer to people is that, in the old days, you could invest in a company at an IPO level, a Facebook or an Amazon. You could try and get involved in private equity. But, we spoke tonight about e-exchanges and companies actually now being able to participate. We did a successful raise with Cedars, which is the largest equity crowdfunding platform in Europe. Funny enough, now the second biggest between Cedars and Crowdcube. They're the second biggest behind the London Stock Exchange. And we're doing a future raise coming up with them in the next couple of weeks, which allows people to participate in high growth companies. So if it's something that you're interested in, then it allows you to participate. Go and join us for the Wealth 5.0. I think Clem has been an incredible way to get started. And Clem, I just really wanted, from the bottom of my heart, to thank you so much for everything that you're doing for all of us in terms of helping us with this knowledge, with the different scenarios, because as both an investor and an entrepreneur and as a human, it helps us make far better decisions of where we're going in the world. And so I really, really wanted to appreciate everything that you've shared with us tonight, but not just tonight. As I said, I highly recommend people go and read the book because it helps them make far better decisions for their life. So thank you for everything that you're doing along with Mitch Ilbury.
Yeah, and I would like to offer a benediction to all the people who read the book. May the fox be with you.
Yeah, it's amazing how, the whole concept of the hedgehog and how the hedgehog was sort of 20th century thinking, and the 21st century is about being far more, foxy and nimble. And as you said, may the fox be with you. Lee, back to you. Sorry, Clem.
I was going to say, it is interesting that a Greek poet who lived in 650 BC is responsible for this concept of the hedgehog and the fox. And we were the first people to use it on the planet. I used it in 1999 in a book called Never Mind the Millennium. But in fact, it's been used by Philip Tetlock in his popular book in America called Super Forecasting. And he has shown in the book that foxes are much better at handling the future than hedgehogs. So he's come to the same decision as we have.
No, that's brilliant. Look, Lee, I know that I've well taken time in terms of trying to encapsulate as much information from Clem, but are there any burning questions that we haven't answered? We'll definitely have a hard stop in 10 minutes at 9 o'clock, but is there anything from your side that I know there's hundreds of questions here, so I don't know where to start.
I think, Scott, firstly, Clem, thank you. As you can see with all the chats coming in, how much people have valued these last 2 hours with you and downloading your brain on what the scenarios are for global and for South Africa. A lot of people coming through and saying, may the fox be with you, Clem. So
that's good. A silver fox.
A silver fox. We have got a lot of questions, over 200 that have come in on the Q&A box, so we are definitely not going to have time to get all of them. But maybe we could go to what your feeling is about cryptocurrency in the future and being the currency of the people.
Yeah, I'm not an authority on cryptocurrencies. I don't have cryptocurrencies myself. I obviously understand where their popularity has come from because, as I said earlier, America particularly is very deeply in debt, and you can make a case for all the emergency funding that has been put in place in Europe and America and elsewhere to try and ease the wretchedness of the pandemic. But there are quite a few economists who have said this could lead to persistent inflation, and therefore one should be investing in hard assets, which obviously include property and gold and cryptocurrencies. We won't know whether the inflation rate is going to taper off. I mean, if hear the chairman of the Fed, he says it will. It's not a problem. But I guess there is a sufficient anxiety around it for people to also diversify into cryptocurrencies and gold and other assets.
Thank you. We also have quite a few questions that have come around about the UK leaving the EU and what the scenarios are around that in the short and medium term.
Yeah, no, I'm actually quite worried about that because, for example, law, a lot of European law was settled in London because London has some of the best lawyers. But the UK now has to negotiate another agreement with the EU now that it's outside the EU, and so that could actually hit the lawyers in London who've been apart from the city, and bankers and stockbrokers have been a kind of real engine of growth in London. And then, there's all these kind of inconvenient things that are happening because there's just less cooperation between European countries and the UK. And, one just has to look at the endless number of, refugees that are setting out from France to UK shores. And I don't think that the problem in Northern Ireland has been resolved properly yet. And everybody says there should never again be a border between Northern and Southern Ireland. but nobody's quite worked out, how, you can move goods from England into Northern Ireland, and not, have some form of checking system before they go into the EU, which is Southern Ireland. So there's lots of tricky problems that have been glossed over, which are coming to the surface, and so we actually quote in the book the whole story of David Cameron. It's like a Greek tragedy that he pressed the button on the vote, fully thinking that people would vote to remain. And what he didn't realize was that, Boris Johnson would come in against him and use his charisma to get the North to vote no. And that's why Britain is now in this position. And so, I'm still waiting to see exactly, how the details are going to play out in terms of future trade, because there are just so many new agreements that have to be negotiated as a result of Britain no longer being part of the common market. And yes, it does give them the freedom to strike deals with Australia and Japan and America and other things. But you know what? Most countries tend to trade with countries close to them. And of course, the closest thing to Britain is Europe. So, I wish them the best of luck.
Thank you. Now changing tact and coming back to the African continent, a very interesting question which you touched on briefly, but this might take you down a little bit of a rabbit hole. How would value-based leadership and encouraging inclusive leadership using African principles add value as a strategy to challenging our current situations in Africa?
No, I'm absolutely conscious of the fact that we should be using the values that are inherent in Africa to kind of motivate a ground-up revolution in our economy. I mean, we kind of look at the rest of Africa and worry about it, but the mobile device in places like Lagos has become the kind of center of so many new businesses. And in fact, Nollywood, as it's called, produces more movies than Hollywood now. So, I'm very conscious of the fact that in creating a people's economy, we should obviously use, our inherent culture here in South Africa, along with obviously some broad principles that go with a capitalist economy.
And then I think this is the last question that we are going to be asked, and it has been asked about 7 times, so I think it is quite pertinent. In what role is the fourth industrial revolution going to play in South Africa with already high rates of unemployment?
Yeah, well, that's precisely why we've got to go for small and micro business, because the fourth industrial revolution has already transformed big business in South Africa. I mean, when I was the CEO of the Anglo gold mines, we had 220,000 people on the Anglo mines, and the gold mining industry had 500,000. And if you looked at the mining industry as a whole, it was even bigger than that, possibly approaching 1 million people. Well, I don't know what it is today, but maybe 150,000, 200,000 in all. So you have seen incredible job destruction already as a result of the fourth industrial revolution, which is why, in promoting small enterprise in South Africa, we're going to have to look at, how particularly mobile devices can empower people to open small businesses, that they can do the marketing on them, they can keep their books on them, They can communicate, obviously. You know, it's going to be like that. But the idea that the fourth industrial wave kills all work is not true. I mean, there's still plenty of services that people offer to communities that are actually done by people, for people. And so I don't have you know, this negative attitude towards the fourth industrial wave. As Scott said when we talked about Darwin, you've got to innovate and adapt. And, you know, South Africans are very good at that. And we've got to do that. I'd like to end with one very empowering story. When I was chairman of the Anglo Scholarship Panel, we interviewed a young man called Siyabulela Zuza. And we said to him, what degree do you want to do? He said, chemical engineering. And it's because when I was 12 years old, I used to mix chemicals in my mother's kitchen and cause minor explosions to her utter dismay. And then I focused on a project which was to create a rocket fuel that was energy intensive. And it took me 2 years to do this. And I then assembled a team. We built a rocket, I put in my fuel, and we beat the South African amateur altitude record. And then NASA got to hear about this project and asked me to enter a competition in America, which I did, and I won it. And NASA was so impressed by my rocket fuel that they named a minor planet after me. It's called the Siyazuza planet, and it's next to Jupiter. Now, how many people in South Africa actually know that NASA named a planet after a young Black entrepreneur in South Africa? But that's the kind of quality of people that we have here. And I just want to release them so that they can be even more creative. And I also want to praise them publicly so that, you know, everybody's aware of the kind of talent that we have here. Because, as I said earlier on, that's what creates a great economy, a good education system, which now has to become entrepreneurial. And people like Siyabulela Zuza, and obviously in America, Elon Musk and others. That's what makes South Africa potentially a great nation.
Thank you very much for allowing us 10 minutes of Q&A time. With the amount of questions we have, we could have you on for another 2 hours. But thank you very much for the insightful discussion, Clem.
Yeah, and I just want to comment as well, Clem, there's hundreds of comments thanking you for your time. You know, I think as Alex Hogg said, a national treasure is an understatement. And, you know, there are literally hundreds of comments of people thanking you for your time and sharing your knowledge tonight. So I really, from the bottom of my heart, really just want to thank you. It's so insightful what you've shared, and it gives everyone the ability to make better decisions in their life. And for that, I'm deeply grateful.
Thank you, Scott, for hosting the show, and thanks, Lee, for handling it in such a wonderful way. And yeah, I hope I've inspired people to go out and be foxes.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, Lee. I think we wrap it up from there.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. To the over 1,000 attendees who have learned from Clem tonight, we hope that it has been valuable. Please do go out and get his book from your nearest bookstore or Amazon. You can get it as a downloadable or on your Kindle. And please sign up for our webinar 5.0, Wealth 5.0 series that is coming at the end of the month. We look forward to sharing with you. And thank you for spending the last 2 hours with us. If you have any burning questions that you'd like us to post to Clem, please do send it through to me and I will see whether I can get the answer. It's lee@globalwealthgroup.com. But thank you, everybody. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.